It's a very well good afternoon to you. Welcome to Rights and Recourse. Once again, we tackle legal issues, bringing you information and, of course, analysis. My name is Sipiwo Nzawumbi. Now, we'll also give you an opportunity to be a part of us right here in studio in our discussion by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling us right here in studio. The number is 011 714 5497 and 5498. Alternatively, you can send us emails. The email address is rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Good afternoon. Now, calls for more transparency over the funding of political parties are growing, with some citing private donations as the key driver of factionalism rather. Earlier this week, the Constitutional Court dismissed the application by some NGOs to have political parties or private political parties funding revealed to the public. Today on Rights and Recourse, we ask you the question: what effect would private finance regulation and disclosure have on South Africa's electoral processes? And now, would they also enhance or undermine public or multi-party democracy? And now joining me in studio is Dr. Ivo Sarakinski, who is from Wits University School of Governance. We're also joined by Professor Sipho Siepe, who is a political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
Perhaps let's start our question with you, Professor. As somebody who has dealt with these dialogues in Africa extensively and also in South Africa, how important is it to disclose private funding of political parties in our also young democracy?
Yeah, I think we should start first with the most obvious, that you do need political parties for the deepening and the functioning of democracy. And for them to function, you also need money. And money is required for them to do research, to campaign during electoral contest, also to sell their own messages.
All right.
And so the issue of funding has always been critical. And in this country, we have an act that allows the public purse to assist the political parties to engage. But the issue here that is raised is about the private donation. There are concerns that are being raised that the non-disclosure might actually lead to a situation where the people's voices might be undermined. So those who are calling for public disclosure are saying we need to build public confidence in the system so that when you have parties, you know that the policies are influenced by the voters, not those with big pockets. So it is that one aspect of public confidence. Then there's the issue of transparency. If you look at our constitution puts prime around the issue of transparency. And there is a concern, or to put this way, an encouragement that when you have transparency, then what you have, you also can deter corruption. And we've seen what monies are doing to a number of parties. Like in your introduction, that there are parties that have actually said that some of their core problems and weaknesses can be linked to the role that money plays in their organization.
But just talking about transparency, I mean, to what extent can political parties be transparent to electorals?
Well, in a democracy, we expect them to be transparent. Actually, this is the highest form of a democracy, when people know what you stand for and they know how you arrive at the decision that you make. So the parties themselves would necessarily not be keen on such. But what you find with the maturing of democracy, that the pressures on parties to be transparent comes. It happens within the party, it happens between the party and the community, and we also expect that it should happen in government.
Iva, let's come to you. Now, the decision taken by the Constitutional Court after the application by My Vote Counts, definitely that was a cry from one of the NGOs representing the general electorate. How big is this issue when you look at the democracies in Africa, the democracies in Europe, in America, and so forth?
It's a massive issue in the developing and developed world. And incredibly complicated and complex with the twists and turns in all of this. But a first point is the Constitutional Court didn't reject the idea of disclosure. What it said was that My Vote Counts followed the wrong route in pursuing the issue of disclosure.
All right.
So they're saying they should have challenged the Public Access to Information Act in a lower court.
Absolutely.
And on the basis of that, pursue a constitutional solution if Parliament refused to modify or amend PIA, as the Public Access and Information Act is known. So there are all kinds of things that flow out of this. Too much transparency possibly have negative outcomes.
That's exactly what the question is. Yes. What is too much transparency in an open democracy? Doesn't the Constitution, and not just in South Africa, but other countries as well, say that if people govern, then it means that whatever the information, or rather what the party gets up to, will be open to them?
Yeah, well, the first issue is that in South Africa, one of the constitutional values is a multi-party democracy. So everything that flows out of the Constitution needs to reinforce multi-party democracy. So a strong argument can be made that too much disclosure could actually damage multi-partyism in intimidating donors from supporting smaller opposition parties. They may fear, and it's a perception, I'm not saying it happens, it's a perception, that if a donor gives money to an opposition party, their business interests may be negatively influenced.
Right.
And in that way, smaller parties get less money, incumbent parties get more money. And you reproduce an unevenness in the political system. And this is a concern that's been raised in a number of developed and developing countries. So disclosure isn't in and of itself a solution to important political controversies. The other side of the coin here is that comparative experience around the world shows that disclosure is remarkably ineffective in restricting special interests from buying politicians.
All right.
What they do is they circumvent the rules. And in America, it's a fine art. And you see scandal.
So it's permissible in other countries?
Well, it's not permissible. It's loopholing. You circumvent the rule and you put money into politics indirectly. And no one knows where that money is coming from. And I can give you a number of examples of that.
But Professor, let me rather come to you. A lot of political parties, especially NGOs, let me rather say NGOs, have said it's essential to know who funds the parties. It is essential for a healthy activism within a young democracy. It is also essential for those who are voting for that particular party to know not only the policies or, the law, as rather you would refer to it, within the party, but also who is behind the finances.
Yeah, I think maybe we should first start with what I was raising. What the Constitutional Court, and I think it is more of an inclination, that if the matter comes back before them, it is most likely that they are going to agree with those who are going to bring it. Because the issue of the merits was never questioned. It was simply a technical approach that the Constitutional Court was concerned about.
What could have motivated it?
Well, I think what you have, you also want to make sure that when people come to the court, there are processes. You don't just jump to the court. But also they are saying, if there's legislation that exists that has some defects, try to address that. So they were simply saying there are processes in which we deal with these issues. We're not rejecting your argument, but to go back there, and once you have gone through that process, you can actually come here. So it is very important that one must understand that there was no rejection of the merits. Then the second issue is the issue of the fear that we have. And I was actually almost indicated that the question that we must ask is the fear so material that we cannot risk on transparency. That is and what people are saying is that you already have a majority of our people who are almost marginalized in democracy. And what those with deep pockets are able to do is to buy influence. And we've seen that almost funny material expression within parties and within various...
It's been a practice throughout Africa.
Exactly. And even in this country, there are people who are saying, we've seen business people almost swaying government or certain politicians in a particular direction because they are almost beholden. So for me, it is really the issue of balancing. And of course, the issue of disclosure is not a panacea because as I've indicated, that you can show a number of examples where people find ways around it. But I do think that...
How then do you think we can strike a balance between the decision by the parties and the electorate?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the business world is very concerned because part of it, they have to weigh it against is another right to privacy. That if I want to give money, I do not want to then to have to explain myself. So there is an issue. I think when the court deals with it, it will balance the issue of the right to privacy. Because I may be committed to democracy and I may want more voices. Even if, you see, you can also support people whose views you do not support, mainly because you want to enrich the debate in society. But there's also a tendency where the business people and other people fear that they might actually be punished for doing so. So that is an issue that we may have to address. And there are models that some people have actually come up with. One, in some countries...
Before we get to those models, because we're running short of time, let's come to you, Ivor. Yes. Do we think perhaps you can see a lot of this activism, breaking out in South Africa from more other NGOs, perhaps, that are political-sided when it comes to their views of the electorate?
Yeah, I think that this has the potential to be highly political. But the issue of what does a citizen need to know to make a meaningful vote is a very conceptual, difficult issue. And one could make the case that knowing who the donors to a party are is only one aspect of many other aspects of the information that a citizen needs to make a rational decision. Right. So the argument here is that if parties don't have enough money to publicize their manifestos, voters go to the vote impoverished with the information and make uninformed choices. So there are a whole range of issues that flow out of this. In terms of your question about other groups...
Perhaps let's expand more on that question when we come back from the ad break. Because of time, we have to quickly take an ad break. Well, if you'd like to join us in our discussion right in studio, the number is 011 714 5497 and 5498. Rights and Recourse will continue after this.
Breaking news. Clientele is giving more back to our clients. In fact, we are giving it all back.
Yes, all your premiums, every single cent you ever paid, on top of your payout amount, in cash, tax-free.
Our new Clientele Ultimate Dignity Plan pays all your premiums back. So let's say you take out 50,000 rands worth of funeral cover. We will pay the full 50,000 rands plus every single premium paid back in cash. Everything within 24 hours.
This is a South African first. No one has ever offered you this before.
Yes, we've been offering you affordable and convenient plans for more than 22 years. You have made us the people's brand. And now we are the first to pay you all your money back.
It's affordable. Plans start from only 120 rand per month.
SMS payback to 47025 and we'll call you back.
Well, welcome back. You're still watching Rights and Recourse right here on SABC News Channel 404. Our poll question this afternoon is, what effect would private finance regulation and disclosure have on South Africa's electoral processes? Well, if you'd like to be a part of us right in studio, you can call the number you see on your screen, or rather go and tweet us at Rights Recourse. Now, gentlemen, before the break, we're still talking about, the actual issue following from the Constitutional Court decision about the availability or the transparency, rather, of these funds to electorals by political parties. Now, let's get into the logistics. Who is allowed, or who rather is in the right standing to inject funding within these political parties, Professor?
Well, I think it's already happening because we have a very good financial systems. And what people are raising is that they know that it is happening. So the issue of logistics does not even arise in terms of the money flow. But what they are saying is that we are actually concerned not so much about the financial systems and those logistics. We are concerned about the influence that makes the citizen to have a lesser of an influence in the policy-making decision. I mean, I was looking at some of the countries where they are even concerned about foreign donors who begin to influence certain countries. And in this continent where you've seen certain wars being fought and where money is channeled from other countries, because there's also a concept of regime change. These concerns are not minor; they are actually very significant. But there is also an assumption that says that if you know everything, then you'll actually make a better policy choice. That is also not true, because people make choices on a number of, there are many things that you look at. You look at the orientation of the party, you look at in the ideological space, you look at its history, you look at the people who support it, and you look at the policy themselves, to what extent are they going to be of benefit to you. So there are quite a whole range. So for people to make a decision, one cannot assume that just because we've got money, it is money that dictates. So we might be overplaying this matter. But nonetheless, when citizens complain, it is very important to hear them. And I think what has happened, which is very interesting, is that all parties, even though they were listed as respondents in the application, chose not to oppose. They simply let it go. So which also shows that there is almost an appetite for a certain form of regulation around this.
What then does this say about the Promotion of Access of Information Act, which was designed to promote the access and to push the effects and the right of accessing this kind of information?
Well, this is what the court said, that if you continue to indicate that there are defects in this law, the best way in which you can approach it is to try to cure those defects and go back to the High Court and raise issues there, and the constitutionality of whether we can agree to making this almost a compulsory disclosure will come to us, and then as a court will make a decision. But you also saw a very strong presentation by the minority judgment, which actually felt that disclosure is very important and critical for the democracy to function.
Iva, do you think that perhaps constitutionally the decision will be taken that these political parties have to disclose this kind of information to electorates?
Well, if the High Court sides with My Vote Counts when they challenge PIA, and Parliament is instructed by the courts to modify PIA, the parties will have to comply. And that will be the legislation that will emerge, that will regulate private donations to political parties.
What sort of flavor would this bring to our democracy?
Well, this is where things start to get interesting. And what I find fascinating in this whole debate is that in America, where you've got the most sophisticated disclosure regime in the world, you've got organizations which are saying exactly the same thing, like My Vote Counts and Right to Know, in the context of a country where you've got disclosure. So why are they saying this? They're saying it because it's really difficult to enforce disclosure. And I think that that we need to look at this very, very closely in shaping the legislation that's forthcoming, so that you have compliance from the parties. The parties have to participate in it. You can't tell them what to do, because then they circumvent it. You've got to make it less onerous to them for them to comply. And that means very careful policy-making regulation. And a blanket disclosure is just going to force this whole thing underground.
What could have possibly led to this kind of activity from electorates, Professor?
Well, there are organizations that for them they always have to find something to complain about. So, but we should also encourage them, because they are deepening, they raise issues that will ultimately become important as we...
Which is democracy in its own.
Exactly. But there are also issues that some people have actually raised, that we should not run the risk of over-regulating in the interest of trying to make sure that people behave in a particular way. Because as one of the former judges indicated, that if you go that route, you'll end up political battles being sorted out by the courts because of over-regulation. So, but I do think that once the matter goes to Parliament, if the court rules in favor of my vote, what will happen is that there'll be a real debate about how do you protect private citizens. Because as a private person, I also have a right to express myself without having to be brought to public excoriation by some people who are maybe unhappy. But at the same time, we should also be saying how far can we go And as I've indicated, all over the world, this is an issue that people talk about. But nonetheless, the debate is a good one, but I don't think we'll go the route that some people think, that there will be no full disclosure.
If you were to take it to Parliament, what would you anticipate as the outcome? Perhaps?
Well, I think, first of all, the minority parties who also enjoy support are going to raise the issue that, yes, we would like to be supported, yes, we would like transparency, but how do we deal with the issue of protection? How do we deal with the people who may support us and who might actually, who do business with government? And there's a sense that there might be some political harassment that may arise. For instance, if a government gives me a big contract and then some people discover that I support an opposition, there is a fear that is material, that people say, I might not get that business with government. So that is a concern. But at the same time, it is there's a countervailing argument that how do we make sure that the right to vote that people fought for and then died for is not diluted by those who have the money.
Either a lot of NGOs and the public were saying that this request on its own is a sign that our democracy is reaching on its peak. The electorates are starting to understand their rights as voters, and also holding our government accountable. Do you perhaps see any kind of synergy being reached by our political parties or other government and the electorate to say, okay, this is how far we can go in terms of transparency?
Well, it's a set of discussions that will come through as the debate unfolds, and that's why I think it's useful to amend PIA, because then it's a clear parliamentary process, and you'll have these hearings, and all these voices will come through. At the moment, we've got a number of civil society organizations who are making important interventions. But it's unclear who they're speaking for. It's unclear what support they have.
You seem to be supporting that.
No, that's a very good point.
It's an absolutely crucial issue they're raising, but
who are they representing?
So what will happen is the next step will be a challenge in the High Court to PIA.
All right.
The High Court will probably rule in favor of my vote count and say that elements of PIA are unconstitutional and must be amended, and they'll set out a framework for the amendment. On the basis of that, Parliament will have to have a whole set of hearings to make that amendment, and it's very difficult to predict what the outcome will be when you've got so many role players who will come in and make their interventions. I think that the more voices that come in to shape this will result in us having much better legislation and frameworks than we have in America, than we have in the United Kingdom, than we have in many other countries, because all the perspectives will have to be accommodated in some way. Better outcome, better result.
All right, well, let's hear what the viewers have to say right there at home. Remember that you can be a part of us right here in studio. The number is 011 714 5497 rather, or 5498. And right now I've got Mesh who's calling me from Soweto. Mesh, welcome to the show.
Hello?
Hello, Nash. You are on air. Welcome to the show.
Okay, hello. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I understand the availability of transparency in South Africa. So what I don't understand is that why are we still not economically free? Why is it that South Africa is a dumping country? I just want to know why.
Professor, perhaps would you like to take on that?
Well, I mean, the issue she raises is the same that Avo raises, but differently. That sometimes we need to ask, who do these organizations, these NGOs represent? Because what you find is that the people in this country are faced with so many challenges. You have a caller here who says, we still feel economically deprived and almost not free. And if you're going to be concerned about the majority, surely you must also listen to the major concerns of the majority. And sometimes you find that there are some people who are interested in these things as conceptual issues. But if we have to protect this democracy, we must make sure that the ordinary people, the majority who feel disenfranchised, start becoming part of this democracy. Otherwise, this will become simply a debate among the elites. So it is very important. And I also think that the NGOs themselves, in as much as they expect disclosure, they must also disclose who actually supports them. Because often than not, it is always on the other side. But I do think that the issue of representation is very important, and represent the people on what the people materially experience on a daily basis. And you often find that when you listen to some of the arguments that are presented, the majority cannot relate to that. And what the young woman is raising is precisely that, yes, I can understand that, but where am I in the discussion? Why are issues that are very pressing for me not being discussed?
All right, let's hold it right there, Professor. Well, maybe you also have an issue that you'd like to raise with us right in studio. Call us. The number is 011714 5497 and 5498. Rights and Recourse will continue after this.
For victory requires intense effort and teamwork. When you get to it, there is no turning back, because all eyes are on you. When it's action time, nothing should stand in your way. Sports Live tackles and analyzes all the sport action. This is the home of all your sport news, updates and more. Sports Live weekdays at 8:30 p.m.
Well, we're still watching Rights and Recourse right here on SABC News channel 404. You can call right in studio and also send us your tweets. Our Twitter handle is Rights Recourse, and of course send us an email address that is at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Now, gentlemen, we had a caller from Soweto earlier on who was saying that they want to vote, and anyone wants to vote for a party that represents their views or what they believe in. The general mantra, especially of those who are your young elite South Africans, or rather Africans, they believe that there is this sinister idea, or rather sinister fear within our government, or rather our democracy, of accountability. The democracy that we now live in fears accountability. Would you say that perhaps that's the case, Professor?
Well, we have a lot of legislation that deals with it, and we have institutions that are on the daily basis exposing the issue of corruption. And we have elections where parties must account to the people, and we also have the dialogues that should happen in society around accountability. Disclosure is simply one of the many forms. I do think that we have enough legislation here to deal with those issues. The issue is whether there's enough political will, and unfortunately, the only way that the parties can be held to account is only almost ineffective way is when you choose not to vote for them because they had actually failed you. And so I don't think there is more of a crisis around that. I think what we need to ask ourselves that why do the voters continue to vote for parties that between elections they complain about? But what it means that there are so many things that the people may be happy with those parties, but they are highlighting quite a few. Because I've had a number of people saying that I'm not happy with this type of leader in the ANC, but I support the party because it stands for a number of things. So there's the whole issue of democracy is much more complicated than we make out to be. So sometimes when people march against you, it's not because they've lost confidence in you. They are also saying, we think you can do better, and you are failing us.
But there seems to be a little consistency on this, what the threshold should be. In UK alone, parties are allowed to disclose their private funders when the funding is over £7.5. Do you think that perhaps in South Africa we could bring that bridge as to say, this is how far you can go in terms of funding or taking private donations? Actually,
when this matter goes to Parliament, these are some of the permutations that people are going to look at. I mean, as we also know that not only the UK, but also the US, they've got the ways in which you say you can go so far and no further. But unfortunately, as Avo says, so society and people with influence always find a way around the loopholes. But we cannot almost over-regulate society. Ultimately, it should be the discussions that we have about what we expect and the enriching of democracy. Democracy is also about the talking. It's about dialogue. It is not about simply regulation. And as I was indicating that one of the former judges was saying, if you over-regulate, you are actually diluting the democracy. Let there be engagement. So it's more social consciousness where citizens says we are not going to allow this to be done in our name.
Another concern was that, you know, the involvement of private donors in political parties could sort of dilute the direction at which the political party would take. If perhaps one stood against corruption and now has got a private funder that perhaps could be involved in such, it would definitely divert what they initially stood for. Do you think that perhaps that could be the case in South Africa?
It's difficult to say yes or no. Let's look at a situation as it works out in government. There's a policy issue that has to be addressed. You've got a whole range of inputs from civil society, from government departments, from a whole range of stakeholders. To influence that output through a donation means that you've got to basically have a cartel conquering a huge number of people involved in the policy process. So just in terms of how policy is made, how legislation's passed, I would say that it's not easy to do that. I would say it's really hard to do that. But it doesn't mean that influence peddlers can buy a clause and insert a focus or an emphasis in a broader policy. But this idea that a donor can buy an outcome, I don't think that. I think our political system is far too complex for that because it's national, it's provincial, it's local, they're national, international stakeholders. You can't just buy all those people. And if you wanted to buy them, it would cost billions, not millions.
And billions.
And most importantly, when legislation is passed, ultimately it must be certified to be constitutionally valid. And there'll be people who, at least we have a very active civil society. If they feel that this will not stand or the constitutional master, they will actually take it there. So the Constitutional Court always looks at some of this legislation that they feel is actually suspect. And all of us have a duty to approach the Constitutional Court because it's actually free to do so. So I don't think, I think the point that I've always mentioning is that one must also understand how the system functions, how many stakeholders come into be. It's not only business, it's civil society, it's political parties, it's ordinary people who are out there who can influence their parliamentary hearings. There must be public hearings before legislation is actually passed. And actually it's required that you go through that process.
One of our viewers asked the question, could this perhaps be a fear from government because of the involvement of government officials in private business bankings?
Well, look, we have enough legislation that shows corruption when it exists. It is not the absence of legislation. It is the absence of proper enforcement of that legislation. But when you look at the PFMA and all other legislation, you actually find that there's a clear understanding from government of what needs to be done. But politicians are politicians, officials are officials, and people are people. So what we need to do is to make sure that we have enough mechanism that helps us to be vigilant of the conduct of our officials as well as the politicians.
In other established democracies, the issue of political funding being transparent is something that's accepted as a no-brainer. Do you think that perhaps a South African government is taking that approach, or Africa in general?
Well, I wouldn't say it's taken as a no-brainer. I think it's taken as a public good, something that deserves to be pursued, acknowledging very serious limitations in how effective it is. So in the United Kingdom, they're busy revising the code which regulates private donations to political parties. This process has been going on for about a decade, and it's still not resolved. It's just that complicated. And I want to try and explain why this is so complicated. If you cap donations above a certain amount, people might come in and say, okay, so you have a meeting, I'll supply the buses, I'll supply the meat, I'll supply the music, and they'll undercost it. Now, if you're going to monitor this, you're going to have a bureaucracy of auditors who are going to have to check and tick every invoice. So the transaction costs of monitoring this will increase dramatically, and it's not clear that you're going to get a transparency dividend that's worth the money that you're going to spend policing it. So these are the challenges around the world that have led to people thinking differently about how you deal with this.
Right.
And there are a whole range of options. Disclosure is one form of regulation, and there are other aspects to regulation that could be considered.
Well, let's go pick a brain and some of our viewers. We've got John who's calling us from KZN. John, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to your guests there.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to make a comment that, you know, I can understand why people do not want to disclose their funding to certain parties. Because what will happen if it's companies, especially that may be dealing with the government, those companies that are supporting other parties will be crucified by this government. They will give them no business. I mean, they won't allow them to actually operate. And I think that is one of the unfortunate, dirty things of the ANC, that they will eliminate funding to other parties if they know who they are. So there is that interpretation.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for your contribution right in on the show. Well, also the number is 011-714-5497 and 5498 in case you want to be a part of us right in studio. Also taking your tweets. Please send us those tweets at Rights and Recourse. And, of course, your email. Send us your emails to our email address, that is rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. But first, maybe before we continue with our discussion, let's go just take a fresh breath. We'll be back shortly.
Your World makes it its business every evening to round up the leading local stories and international news to keep you informed all the time.
Make a date with Your World every evening for all the news headlines around the world to keep you abreast with knowledge.
Catch Your World for headlines across the world every Monday to Friday from 9 p.m, then Saturday and Sunday from 7 p.m.
Welcome back. You're still watching Rights and Recourse right here on SABC News Channel 404. Now, our poll question today is, should political parties be transparent as to who is funding them? And how important is that in enhancing our oh-so-young democracy? Let us know what you think. The number is on your screen as you see it, 011-714-5497 and 5498. Now, we had the caller before the break. Let's take on that one, Professor.
Well, let me start by saying the political process involves a lot of people and stakeholders. Civil society has a responsibility to also influence policy. Business, for its own interest, also will want to play a role in influencing policy. So we must understand that the issue of influence comes from all quarters. There's a tendency where we actually think that civil society represents all that is good and business represents all that is bad.
Yes.
And that is not sustainable. So we must deal with that and put it aside.
I think more than anything, the parameter, the question is, where's the parameter? Where do you draw the line between the involvement of businesses in political activities and vice versa? That's
why ultimately the nature of making law in this country has been very transparent, has been made transparent. There are submissions, there are government officials, there are studies by academics. There are so many people who come into play, and ultimately the law is known by everybody who wants to know. So there is an issue of what you call transparency there. But what is also important is that we also need to normalize a situation where supporting a party, whether you're a business or a person, should be fine. There was a time when black people in general seem to be uncomfortable with supporting the DA. But now that fear We broke through that fear. So I'm still trying to grapple with this fear of disclosure, in as much as I hear the concerns. But I do think that given that the concerns are material and expressed and they are felt, it is possible to come up with a legislation that will cater for those. And that is where the balance will be drawn in terms of how do we make sure that multi-party democracy thrives, but at the same time making sure that my vote also counts.
Iva, early on you made reference to disclosing too much being harm in our democracy. Do you think that perhaps that's the concern of the ruling party and other governments in Africa?
I don't know, so I can't say. I prefer not to speculate in that regard. All that I can say is that there are different ways of dealing with this very important and very difficult and sensitive issue. And one avenue that we see in the international experience is to cap expenditure by political parties. And parties have to disclose their audited accounts. So parties, of course, can fiddle the numbers, but there is information coming into the public domain on how much they spent on advertising. And that can open up avenues for investigative journalists to start to ask tough and difficult questions. And another avenue that's been proposed in the policy debate here is that donations be made to a blind trust anonymously. So you have a blind trust and you have a system where the donation becomes laundered so that the money arrives in a blind trust. No one knows who put the money into the blind trust, and then you disperse that money to political parties, and you've got to have a formula for doing that. So in other words, if parties don't know who the donors are, they don't have to think about placating powerful special interests. And these kinds of things can be done with a bit of imagination, with a bit of creativity. So the point here is South Africa's at a crossroads in a sense. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed. Let's not repeat what hasn't worked elsewhere. Let's use all of this debate and analysis.
What hasn't worked where?
The disclosure in America, disclosure in the United Kingdom.
Worked.
It doesn't work. So
is it because the electorate feels a sense of ownership?
The loopholing. The money finds a way to political parties to buy influence and to buy policy outcomes. So let's use this opportunity that's been created
to review,
to come up with the South African solution that leads the world as our constitution leads the world. And let's look at all of these options, let Parliament deliberate, let all these inputs come through, and let's come up with something that's more effective. It's never going to be perfect, but let's come up with a new way of dealing with this that's more effective than these old ways that don't work. So Albert Einstein once said, insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again.
Hoping for a different result.
Hoping for a different result. We've seen that doesn't work. Let's try a different approach that might have better outcomes.
Professor, what could work in South Africa?
Actually, I think what we need to do is also to ask what are the sources of influence in policy making. Because we tend to narrow it into only political funding by business people, etc. But there are also many other ways in which people can influence policy. You have the media that influences policy, that influence the way the politicians work. You have such institutions that are embedded in certain positions. You have academics who are embedded in certain positions. You have some civil society. The question that has been raised is that who do they represent? So we need to complicate this story about influence, that all of us are participating in one way or another in this influence. The issue that should be on the table is that how do we begin to make sure that all these varied influences do not dilute the right of people to choose. But we should also understand that there's nothing wrong about influence, because sometimes I might be influenced and that influence may be so influential because it brings perspectives that I was not aware of. But what we have here, we've narrowed it to only one thing, as if once you solve this, all these other issues would be resolved. But I do think that, given the caller that has come, I'm also concerned that to what extent are we deepening democracy by speaking to the material reality that the majority faces in this country.
All right.
Or is this simply a pastime that I might be, and I might also be given money that I must spend by somebody else? So this issue cannot just be left as if it's simply the business people who are problematic.
Well, another notion was that of not biting the hand that feeds you, and also that perhaps, withdrawing a government from its initial responsibilities, and a fear that perhaps that could arise in South Africa as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's also something that which comes on to that one of the things that we have here are also competing rights. This notion of transparency, I mean, I was trying to push to that element of, there's an element of capping that is a possibility, but there's also the issue of my rights as a private citizen, the right to privacy. So this is not simply an issue of saying once there's a disclosure we sorted out things, because it trumps on some other rights. So that's why I think that the deliberation that will take place in Parliament when this matter goes there will weigh all these other issues. But most importantly, we can't simply borrow things from outside and they dump them here and think that they can actually work when they actually fail to work where they were.
Early on, Ivor, you spoke about reviewing what didn't work for other democracies. What perhaps would you think is a better approach in our also developing democracy in South Africa?
Well, I think I'm prepared to say quite firmly that
just briefly
that a disclosure above a certain limit doesn't work.
All right.
Because it just gets loopholed and the money enters politics through a different route. So to say that we must be fundamentalist in our understanding of transparency is going to perhaps make things worse rather than better. So transparency is never an absolute. You try and strive for transparency, and you never achieve full transparency. You go as far as you can in terms of balancing a whole range of effects, and that's the debate Parliament will have to have.
All right. Well, Ivor says transparency is never an absolute. Do you also think so? Well, call us right here on the show. It's 011 714 5497 and 5498. We'll continue. Stay with us.
Get behind Rugby World Cup 2015 on SABC.
Welcome back. We're still taking your calls. Call us right here on the show. We want to get your view on what you think about political parties getting private funding from private donors. Do you think that perhaps this should be brought into books and accountability to the electorates and those who are voting for these parties? Or do you think that also democracies and political parties are entitled to privacy? Let us know. Would like to hear your views. Now, let's get into the issue of public funding, the argument against that says that public funding preserves a status quo that keeps the established parties and candidates in power.
Well, actually, like we indicated from the onset, that for democracy to function, you need parties, and for parties to do a good job, they need financial support. Then it also suggests that the parties that get more money are able to do more things than parties that get little. So there is that element in there. And we have a system of proportional representation which is there in the Constitution, and I'm not too sure unless you change that we must understand what are the legislative constraints to change that, and that you find in our approach to this democracy. So there's that element is true. That's why some people are saying we need to have private funding so as to be able to do what the majority party is able to do. And I think that's a bane of, or that's a challenge that you find all over the world, that parties that are established tend to reproduce themselves, tend to have, because they have a national footprint. So, but what it means is that the small parties can still, they'll have to do much more. I mean, they take the EFF, what it has actually done. It has just come into the scene, but it has managed to displace. So it is also not true that the fact that you have the money makes it absolute that you cannot make some traction in the political space. What it means that you must find more creative ways in which you can actually make a case for what you stand for. And for as long as a party remains relevant, people will support it. But when parties are irrelevant, no amount of money is going to save them.
Well, another notion is through public funds, taxpayers are now forced to support political parties and candidates whose views they do not support. Isn't that perhaps, jogging a little our democracy, Ivor?
Yeah, there are countries that have done that. And it raises a whole range of other issues. Citizens sometimes resist making payments to political parties compulsory because their view is that money should be used better for uplifting the people or providing development.
And their needs.
Because politicians and political parties, unfortunately, around the world don't have a lot of trust amongst citizenry. Citizens vote for them, but they don't trust them. And surveys show this repeatedly. So people are reluctant to be taxed specifically for that. At the same time, it raises the issue of how you distribute that fund. And it comes down to the issue of proportionality. Just because you've got a large number of seats doesn't mean you should necessarily get the lion's share of that fund. And until we come up with a formula that's equitable, public money distributed to political party is going to continue to be very controversial.
All right. Well, let's hear what John in Johannesburg has to say. Remember that you can also call us right here on the show. The number will reflect on your screen. Do participate and give us your views on what you think about public funding, or rather private funding, funding public parties. John in Johannesburg, we'll welcome you on the show.
Hi, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
I'd like to pose a question to your guest regarding the issue of political parties having a private investment arm, for example, Chancellor House, that invested in Hitachi in the Medupi project. How do we regulate this? Because I think it does provide some serious challenges to our political dispensation. I can give you an example that, or maybe a question. Is it possible that the delays that have taken place in completing the Medupi power station could have been as a result of the fact that the ruling party was in bed with one of the investors? And to milk the cow even more, they decided to extend and extend and extend the completion. Is this an issue to be included in the regulation process?
All right.
Thank you. I'd listen on the
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. John is concerned about the issue of regulation, precisely. Prof?
Yeah, first, I think the issue of investment arm is something that may be worth talking about. But one must also understand that it has not been considered to be illegal. And also, it could also be argued that other parties have investment arms that have not been declared. There are parties that have been in existence that you will know that if you think about these institutions, you think about these companies, they have been benefactors of that particular party. What has become more clear is that at least we could make a direct link to the ANC, because it has not said it is not linked to that in terms of the Chancellor House. So that is one matter that if we're going to go that route, then we must make the entire game almost open. And then what you may find that there are many parties in this country that are benefiting from quite a large number of companies, but the manner in which the system is sophisticated that you will not be able to see the direct link. But there is a direct link to many of some of the companies that exist that support certain political parties. So if you go that route, the issue of completing, I'm not too sure that if you were to look at major projects all over the world, you might actually find that most of them are not delivered on time. So there might be simply a managerial incompetence, there might be skills challenge and all that, but I would not easily link it to that. But it is also possible.
Ivor?
Yeah, the Hitachi Chancellor House issue is very important.
Absolutely.
And very significant. I just want to bring something into the debate that I think is being missed quite often. The Mail and Guardian blew the story in 2006. And that's very, very significant because what you see in countries where you have disclosure, these organizations promote investigative journalism to uncover abuse of the disclosure system. So we've got secrecy and investigative journalists blew the story. In countries where you've got disclosure, investigative journalists blow abuses and uncover abuses and put them into the public domain. So what comes out of that is very important in that we need to strengthen investigative journalists. They are best placed to uncover these kinds of abuses. The issue of the links between the companies and a political party is sensitive. It could be argued that there is a conflict of interest and that it is problematic. But the core issue, the journalists uncovered and broke the story and hence the fine that Hitachi's paid in America.
Well, gentlemen, unfortunately, because of time, there seems to be a lot to disclose and to bring forward in this discussion. But unfortunately, because of time, we have to round up our discussion. Well, this has been Rights and Recourse right here on SABC News Channel 404. The program is repeated at 10 tonight and 5 on Monday morning. From all of us right here in studio and the rest of the team, it's goodbye and God bless you.